Hello there from Washington and the DMV, as we like to call it, which is not the Division of Motor Vehicles. When we say DMV in DC, we actually mean District, Maryland, and Virginia. But I'll admit, every time I hear the words DMV, even I, for a second, wonder if I'm talking about the Department of Motor Vehicles. But I am coming to you from inside the Beltway. And coming up, I have a fascinating conversation with Don Bacon. He's a Republican congressman from Nebraska. He's from that congressional district that is very swingy. Nebraska is one of the few states that allows congressional districts to be split. I have a feeling the state of Nebraska is likely to get rid of that rule coming up. And if they do, Maine will likely do the same, but we shall see. But that Omaha district has gone blue, I think, the last few times. So we've had these split decisions out of there. But they have voted simultaneously for president, and they've elected Don Bacon, a Republican, to Congress. And I really think it does sort of tell you a lot about Omaha in general and sort of where, you know, where there's different wings, if you will, of the Republican Party these days. Because I think when you see a guy like Don Bacon get elected and you see Democrats carried in a presidential, I think it tells you what type of Republicanism they don't like, because this is a Republican leaning area in general. This is certainly Omaha itself is a 50-50 place. The city, for years, they've gone back and forth, Democratic mayors, Republican mayors. You know, it's always been a swing area of the state, but generally it leans pretty Republican. But I think what you see here is, what I find interesting here is something that I think, you know, this fight that we're going to see inside the Republican Party over tariffs, and this fight that I think we're now, which may end up accelerating a larger fight about national security, because in many ways, Donald Trump, I think, whether he means to or not, certainly is the leader of a new version of the Republican Party, or arguably an older version of a Republican Party that dates itself back to the late 19th century, early 20th century. And back then, the Republican Party was a very protectionist party. Of course, the party of being the party of business, it actually was very logical why back then business wanted protection, because back then we didn't have air cargo travel. Back then we had, so American businesses wanted their businesses protected, if you would, from outside influence, outside exports. And so it made a lot of sense that the Republican Party, being the party of business back then, would be in favor of tariffs back then. Ironically, I think today's business, while they want to align with the Republican Party that was sort of from the Eisenhower to Romney era, one for low regulation and low taxes, is not advocating these tariffs. There's a couple of industries that are, but not many. And I think there's a real question now, and this is something I've been thinking about quite a bit, and about our polarization, right? We've been in the middle of a political realignment now, arguably, for 20 years. I mean, in some ways, it's ever since the end of the Cold War, we've begun this what I would call this realignment and this splintering of coalitions that were very steady during the Cold War. But if you think about this sort of calendar of events, right? The wall falls in '89, and the first evidence of the Trump era shows up in 1992 in the form of Pat Buchanan, a conservative pundit back in the day, worked for Richard Nixon, was a speechwriter. He challenged the sitting president back then, a Republican, George H.W. Bush, and challenged him for the nomination. He didn't get very close, but he found a following. He had and it was if you go back and listen to a Pat Buchanan stump speech in Manchester, New Hampshire in 1991 and 1992, it'll sound very familiar. It's tough on immigration. It is definitely articulating beliefs in a bit of retreat. Buchanan, for years, was seen as anti-Israel because he was really anti-foreign aid to anybody, including Israel, back in the day. He was certainly he was one of the early conservatives speaking against free trade agreements. He was violently anti-NAFTA. And so when you now look back at the time, he was considered kind of a gadfly, kind of a loudmouth. Yes, there's always been this sort of constituency available to Republicans back then, but it was a small, wasn't a majority constituency. Certainly it wasn't where the donor community was, and it really wasn't where sort of, if you think about, I always think about most of the American people are somewhere between the 30-yard lines if you want to lay us out on a football field, right? There really is only about 15% of the entire country is further to the left or further to the right than those sort of invisible lines that I've drawn there at the 30-yard line. And if you want more detail on that, just go down a Pew Research rabbit hole, and you'll sort of see how the progressive left and the MAGA right collectively is not even 20% of the population. But right now, you could argue that they're having more than their fair share of influence on the two parties. And it's made me think at this point, especially, this really clicked into my head in 2016, where we really could have easily been if we had been a sort of European democracy. Think France, which has 4 major parties, maybe 4 people on a general election, top 2 would meet in a runoff. Well, if we were a 4-party system in 2016, you'd have had Bernie Sanders, sort of the Green Party nominee or the Progressive Party nominee. You'd had Hillary Clinton as sort of the Lib Dem, if you will, to compare it to the UK, or sort of the center-left party. You'd have had a Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio as the nominee for the center-right party. And yet had Donald Trump as sort of the nationalist, right? The nominee of the Nationalist Party. And perhaps if there's a runoff, it would have been Trump Sanders, or perhaps it would have been, Rubio Clinton. It could have gone in any different direction, depending on what the top 2 were. And perhaps, look, this isn't what we are. We have a duopoly in this country. I think it's a duopoly that's doing a lot of damage now. I think it's a duopoly that is making the democracy a bit weaker than it ever has. I think in some ways we do have arguably 4 robust political movements that might be deserving of its own political party, rather than trying to stuff 2 of them into these larger coalitions. And I have this thesis that if you had to create a coalition to attain power, like many parliamentary systems work, or even these sort of hybrid sort of multi-party democracies work, then you would be more comfortable building a coalition to enact power, right? And it would only arguably empower more folks, number one, at the negotiating table, and number 2, I think you would have, yes, it would be more incremental movements, but it would be incremental movements that were more likely to stick, rather than this sort of whiplash that we are getting in public policy that is arguably created or accelerated the instability that we have. The reason I bring this up, because you're going to hear from Don Bacon, and he really is. Here's a guy that is filing a bill to try to take tariff power away from the Republican President Donald Trump. Here's a guy that just wrote an op-ed very critical of some of the movements the Trump administration's making when it comes to a rapprochement to Russia. He's been very supportive of Ukraine in the war, in that aggressive action that the Russians took to invade their country. And he's very concerned. And look, he's, in that sense, he is being a representative of his area. Omaha and Nebraska in general will get hit hard by these tariffs, very hard. All of the ag states are going to get hit hard by these tariffs. It's not an accident that Chuck Grassley, the Republican senator from Iowa, Don Bacon, a Republican congressman from Nebraska, are 2 of the leading sponsors of sort of companion bills that would essentially try to take this emergency tariff power away from the president. He really shouldn't have this power. There's really no emergency out there. He's manufactured this emergency. And if Congress has the authority to take it away from him, the question, of course, is when is there going to be the political will, particularly in the House, to do that? I don't want to prejudge the conversation you're about to hear with him, but I think it is something you'll hear that there's a bit of a strategy here. A lot of it will depend on the impact these tariffs have over the economy. I think the jobs report is a lagging indicator of the health of the economy. But I understand if I were in the Trump administration over the weekend, I'd be trying to use the jobs report as proof. Hey, playing Kevin Bacon in Animal House, remain calm, all is well. Look, the jobs report. Blah. Guess what? Jobs report literally is, when you think about it, we always report it first Friday of the month, but it really is signifying the health of the jobs market as of the 15th of the prior month, right? That's really what it tells you. So this is an indicator of what the job market was pre-Liberation Day. So this is just the beginning. Obviously, what the markets do all day on Monday is going to be impactful of some of the political reaction here. But look, politically, I do think, as I said in our little emergency, our first of what may be many emergency pods that we start putting up here at the Chuck ToddCast, um, I do think that this is his Afghanistan withdrawal. This is something. It's just like, it's funny. Donald Trump is convinced that fair trade is something that's popular, right? And when you poll fair trade, everybody's for fair trade. It sounds good. Reciprocal tariffs, making the case, hey, you should whatever a country's taxing us, we should tax back, right? I think fairness is something that's very easy sell. But then the impact of it suddenly becomes very difficult to sell because the impact is uneven. The impact isn't what is necessarily the rhetoric President Trump is saying is on that front. And the reason I compared to the Afghanistan withdrawal is like getting out of Afghanistan was very popular. In fact, the Biden administration assumed that they were, as long as they got out of Afghanistan, how they got out wasn't going to be a big deal. But it really he never recovered from it because how he got out created a competence question about the administration. And when you have competency suddenly becoming a sort of front of mind of voters, that is it's almost impossible to recover from. You can, Barack Obama recovered from the arguably the incompetency of not being able to get the website up for healthcare. They paid a steep price, but he went out there and sort of owned it. And they made a very public attempt to bring in the best and the brightest to try to fix it. They sort of leaned into the problem to try to fix the problem. Donald Trump, instead of trying to sell the country on tariffs and explaining his policies, left Washington early to golf. I mean, if you were the Democratic Party looking for a visual to use to attack Donald Trump, sort of the let them eat cake moment, if you will, you couldn't come up with a better visual than him rushing down to his golf course, rushing to play. He apparently there's some senior championship, which of course he will be the winner of because it's his own golf club. We used to laugh at the North Korean leaders who would talk about their golf exploits, and now we have our own leader who likes to talk about his golf exploits. But he's not even attempting to sell or fix this problem. And then you have the issue where economists are looking at the math, if you will, that the Trump administration put out and how they came up with the various reciprocal tariffs that they came up with. And apparently, they'd be laughed out of, economics 101 classes. So this really gets at it's how they did this, feels a bit haphazard. And I think it creates a competency question. And again, George W. Bush, Katrina, and Iraq, the combination of those created a competency crisis, for Bush that he never recovered from, and his party started to pay a steep price in 2006 and then paid another price in 2008. This wasn't something that went away after one cycle. I think it's pretty clear that Democrats paid a competency price. Joe Biden did from the Afghanistan withdrawal a little bit in 2022, although Donald Trump and his bad Senate recruits made it seem as if Democrats survived the worst. But of course, then came 2024, and they just couldn't get out of that shadow. And that thing just sort of, if you recall, his approval rating dropped below 45, and he never got above it. He never got above it. And I'm pretty confident that Donald Trump's never going to get above 45 because this economy, again, either he gets rid of all these tariffs and because he negotiates all these side deals, and he doesn't reindustrialize the country, and business doesn't sort of bounce back right away because they're not sure if Donald Trump's going to change his mind again, right? Or he sticks to his guns because if he does believe in his policy, you are going to need to stick to this for years, not months, not weeks, but years. And there's this horrendous sort of, essentially you have to, and there are some people that believe this, you have to knock down the house and rebuild it. Right. And when you knock down, you're going to create a lot of destruction. So in some ways, you have to destroy the global economy in order to rebuild this sort of singular industrial economy that perhaps Peter Navarro and some of his other trade advisors are dreaming of. But neither scenario encourages a growing economy. Neither scenario encourages investment in the United States. So it is, how he did it. I think he's made his tax cut, put his tax cut in jeopardy. Obviously at this point. I think if he should have ordered this differently if he really believed in this tariff regime. But now he's made it where even if he passes a tax cut, it's going to have zero impact on improving people's lives, zero impact on getting money into their hands. And if anything, all they're going to see is the cost of everything else go up. So whatever cut he may be producing, and the last time he cut taxes, it didn't cut everybody's taxes. He cut corporate taxes more than he cut individual taxes. In fact, for some people, taxes went up, particularly if you lived in a suburb in a light blue in a state that had a state income tax. So I think he has put his entire presidency in jeopardy of being an effective presidency. But as always, he's put himself at the center of the story and the center of the debate. But this is going to be a pretty rough ride, and we may be. I think the turbulence. The one thing I wonder about is the turbulence so great that this is what actually fractures the Republican Party into something that we haven't fathomed. Is this the beginning of turning splitting the Republican Party into two, and you end up having essentially two parties on the right, one that is a business-centric sort of belief in a global order, and one that is an isolationist nationalist party on that front. And of course, I think once one splinters, the other one could splinter just behind it. So look, this is just a way to watch this in a macro sense, but in the micro sense, I think watching to see how Congress reacts to the markets over the next week or two is still going to be the best way to understand the political impact of all of this. So with that, we will sneak in a break. When we come back, my conversation with one of the few Republicans willing to speak out against Donald Trump's policies, both on national security and the economy. And joining me for a conversation here about sort of the tumultuous week that we've had on the economy is Republican Congressman Don Bacon, who is from Omaha, and many people who follow the presidential election know his district well because Nebraska is one of two states that splits their electoral votes. So the Omaha congressional district has been one of those probably the swingiest district as far in America when it comes to ad spending. But the congressman there is Don Bacon, and while he has tough races, he makes it through. Congressman, it's good to see you.
Thanks. Good to be back on with you. It's good to see you again.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, let's start with, because I have a little bit of time and we can do context to our answers, just for people that aren't as familiar with the Omaha economy. And, it's been a great 30 years in Omaha, right? If you look at it from that big 30-year picture, it's more of a diverse economy than it was 30 years ago. Give the elevator pitch. Be my Chamber of Commerce guy here about what's been happening with the Omaha economy and why it's been a good economy for the last generation.
Well, this is what I advised our mayor candidate. She's been the mayor for 12 years. Said, Mayor, all you got to say is this. Forbes races the number one city in America to live in. 2, we're the fastest growing economy in America at 9%, 9% GDP growth right here. And we're one of the few big cities where crime has gone down. It's a great place to live. So the economy is very diverse. It's got an ag business component to it. We have Weston Foods. We have 85% of the world's irrigation sales come out of here. I can go on and on. So it's an agribusiness haven. But we're also a transportation hub. You have Union Pacific. Right. You have Burlington Northern has other division headquarters here. We have a lot of the largest trucking companies in Omaha. But third, it's the third largest financial sector in America. Right. Insurance is the big driver of that. We also have the largest private bank in Omaha, right? But you have Aflac, Mutual of Omaha, Pacific Life, New York Life. I just go on and on. So the insurance financial industry is just taken off in Omaha. And you put all that together, we have a dynamic economy and low unemployment, and the standard of living here, or the cost of living, is very competitive.
No, it's actually, you can get a good job there and pay a little bit less to live there than you are in some bigger cities. So tell me your great fear right now about this tariff regime that's been placed on essentially every country in the world, what that could mean for Omaha's economy.
Well, we are an export state. We're America's largest beef exporter, for starters. And we're
Mhm.
top five when it comes to pork, corn, soybeans, popcorn, ethanol. So we're an export state, export city. And I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, I hope it turns
Sure.
out well. So I have no idea, but I see a lot of risk. When you lose $6 trillion in the stock market in 2 days, that says a lot. We've already seen a loss in customers when it comes to beef and popcorn. I've talked to the big exporters, and some of these European markets have already shut themselves down. I don't think anybody wins in a trade war.
Right.
And I don't know why we want to take on the entire world at once. I would have done this more surgically. I would have probably focused on China up front, maybe Russia with their behavior. I would have
Mhm.
negotiated with Europe. Now, Europe doesn't have high tariffs, but they have a lot of rules. We can't find a way to get our beef, for example, in the European
Mhm.
market because they put a lot of restrictions that make it very hard to get in. So we should have these negotiations. I know who our allies are and who our adversaries are. And so taking on the whole world, it seems very risky.
Right.
It's not wise to me. I like if somebody's got a tariff on us. I think we should have a level playing field. But
Sure.
I think we've done enough analysis that a lot of the numbers that the White House used were not actual tariff numbers. They were fudged in a lot of ways. And so therefore, you can't just say it's reciprocal tariffs. They're not.
If I were working in the congressional liaison office at the White House, you'd be one of the people I'd have on speed dial, given your sort of the fact that you're in a swing district, the fact that you're in this diverse economy that you're a representative of. Did you get a heads up? Did they call? I mean, does somebody from the White House going, hey, we're thinking about this. What do you think? Any of that kind of conversation?
They have some pretty good legislative liaison. There's three that I
Mhm.
know of that we could call. I don't think they give us a heads up a whole lot, but the president himself told me when I was in the Oval Office, and we had two others of us in there, that he wanted to do
Mhm.
reciprocal tariffs. That if somebody's putting a 5% tariff on us, we should do 5% back. That's a hard one to attack because
Okay.
I think we like having a level playing field.
Right.
But I think we went way beyond that. I don't think we're doing well. For example, Israel took off all their tariffs 2 weeks ago, and we put
Right.
a hefty tariff on them after the fact. That's just one example. Why are we doing tariffs on Canada when we have a trade deal with them and they're abiding by the trade deal? These are the kind of questions I have, and I
What?
don't. I don't think they're really reciprocal tariffs. If they were, they would look a lot different.
it- I guess that's which, and I guess do you understand what is the goal? And I'm going to sketch this out because if the goal is to essentially reindustrialize the United States, then then in theory there should be no negotiations on these tariffs. But if the goal is to lower trade barriers, essentially create a more level playing field, then you're not really going to change the industrial base of the United States. So, do you have a good sense of what the real goal is here of the Trump administration?
I was listening to the Treasury Secretary today on a one of the
Mm.
talk shows in the morning, and he made it clear his goal is to bring back industry back to our country. So he laid it out pretty clearly. When I've talked to the president and hear him talk, he often talks about level playing field. These guys are blocking our products, and so we
Hmm.
so we don't have a fair deal. So you hear a little bit of both depending on who you're talking to. I believe I'll give you an example. I already mentioned that Europe has lots of rules that block our
Right.
exports. We should try to knock those down and talk to them about it. And not, I wouldn't go to tariffs right away, but I would, form some meetings and say, hey, it's not fair that you get to sell anything you want in our country, and we can't
Right.
get corn and beef and pork into your guys' countries. And we should have that dialogue. But well, looking at the Treasury Secretary today, it sure sounded like their goals to bring back manufacturing, and there was a lot of questions in my mind on that. We have two workers for every retiree now. It's not like
Yeah.
we were 30 years ago where we had 10 workers for every retiree. I'm not sure we have that kind of workforce anymore, but uh, I don't know. I think it's a high risk move what they're doing here.
Right. Let me just go to ag exports. If it's not as if uh, I would assume Nebraska is making more food, if you will, to than it needs to feed Nebraska, right? So if it wasn't for
Absolutely.
exports, the ag industry in Nebraska wouldn't make any money. Um, if you can't sell your beef overseas, where would it go?
Yeah, we would be. You'd see a depression in the beef market here, the beef industry,
Right.
and we have a great market because people like Nebraska beef. It's world renowned. That is the one area that you do find some buyers in Europe. If you say Nebraska beef, they'll buy it and they put it on their menu as such.
Omaha
But really, we
steaks.
have
I
a
mean,
big, yeah,
many
Omaha
a
steaks.
holiday. We've all gotten our Omaha steaks box, right?
So we would probably still have some markets in Asia, but even then, we're putting tariffs on them, and they're going to reciprocate
Yeah.
that. And so it's going to the ag industry suffers in a trade war, and because this is the low hanging fruit for other countries to go after when it comes to
Right.
America. Nobody can produce beef, pork, corn, and soybeans at a price that we can in the Midwest because we do it at a scale that nobody else can do it at. We have one rancher here in Nebraska that has 200,000 head of cattle. Our governor does like 1,500 piglets every day born. It takes 1,500 to the market. When we do it at a scale that most people can't think of, that which gives us a great price, and it makes us very competitive. But if we don't have trade, it would really hurt the Midwest economy. It's not just Nebraska, Iowa as well.
Right. Well, it's not lost on me that Chuck Grassley, Iowa Senator, Don Bacon, Nebraska Congressman, you guys are two of the co-sponsors here of essentially Make Congress Do Its Job Again Act. I don't know what else it's called, but it's like the tariffs are your job, not the president's job. And, look, we have 30 years of this. This is bipartisan atrophy, if you will, when it comes to congressional action on this
It
stuff.
is.
But, you and I both know House Republicans are going to stick by this president. For the most of your colleagues are going to stick by him for a while, but obviously you introduce it here. It sits here. Is this something that a discharge petition, some sort of bipartisan majority forces this vote? Or do you think more time is needed for you to make the case to some of your Republican colleagues?
It's a good question. First of all, I love the history I'm a history guy. So, the Republicans are very protectionist, particularly in the late 1800s. We wanted high tariffs. Was the Smoot, I can't think of the last name.
Smoot Hawley. Yeah, Smoot Hawley, not Josh Hawley. No,
Yes.
no relation.
Smoot Hawley, they were both Republicans, and they passed these high tariffs in 1930. And that really put us in a deep depression. And the Republicans have ever since said, we learned our lesson. Free trade is the right way to go. In fact, that's how you provide the best merchandise, the best product, if you will, at the lowest cost in the most efficient manner. And it keeps our manufacturers sharp because you got to compete. We've bought into this. Now we're going back to our roots. It's funny, the Democrats were more protectionist, 1970s and 80s.
Congress, when I was growing up, that was right. It was the Democrats were the protectionist party. I have all these, you see, I have this little paraphernalia. It was the Democrats putting out buttons, Japan with a cross in it, all this stuff. But there was a young man in the 1980s who took out a full-page ad trashing America's trade policies with Japan. That young man was Donald Trump.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was also thinking Buchanan.
Yeah. Well, him too. I mean, no, you're not wrong. I mean, I've always said Pat Buchanan, the beginning of the MAGA movement actually started in 1992. Right. That was the beginning of this movement inside your party. And now you went from being a majority view in your party, Free Traders, you're in the minority. This has been a huge switch.
At the moment, I think you're right because they're following the president's lead. But I'm philosophically a Milton Friedman guy. I read the Smith on free trade and the invisible hand. All the kind of stuff that I buy into it. But it's funny, the Democrats sound like Republicans today, Republicans sound like Democrats, and that's sort of beyond. Also on Ukraine and Russia, same thing. So I call a lot of my peers who are so-called right-wing Republicans, I call them their George McGovern Republicans. And they go, who's that? I go, that guy ran for president in 1972, and you sound just like
all these same policies. Yeah.
So
let's make a deal with the Russians. Let's have protection. Yeah.
Yeah. But this is how I see this happening. We're going to submit this bill Monday.
Yeah.
And already Senator Grassley and his Democrat colleague, they've already submitted it in the Senate. They got 7 Republicans already are co-sponsors. You could see a pathway to 60 here, depending on how the market goes, inflation, unemployment based off what happens with these tariffs. I think it's going to be a lot longer for the House to get there. I get that. But if the Senate ends up passing it and we're not seeing good traction in the economy, you're going to see people say, okay, this isn't working. And we got to restore our authorities. In the Constitution, it says Congress has
Right.
the authority for tariffs and taxes. And by the way, some Republicans are in denial. Tariffs are a tax on consumers. There's no other way around it. That's what it is. We have that power, but we gave it away approximately a century ago.
Yep.
An emergency. If it was an emergency, then the president can do it. So the Congress needs to say, okay, this is being abused. It's not an emergency. This is whole policy being written. Or it is possible the courts will intervene.
I was just going to ask you about the courts.
Yeah. The courts may take a look at it too.
They look, this judiciary seems a little, at least on the Supreme Court, a little hesitant. What I've noticed about the Supreme Court, they're hesitant to get involved in these fights, but they do, when they do rule, they seem to say, hey, Congress has the upper hand here if they choose to use it.
And so I think they're interpreting the Constitution the way I read it. And so I think our courts did a great job, despite all the criticism that you hear from time to time. But this is how I see this bill. This bill will probably take a little longer in the House. And I think if we don't see traction in the economy and we continue to see a slide in the market, we may see some inflation come out of this when people have to raise prices. People may say, you know what, this is the Congress role. So I think I have this down as something that I believe it's very possible that could pick up steam in a couple months. And we'll have it ready to go.
Let's talk about, when I first booked you, it was before Wednesday, Liberation Day. We can make all the liberating ourselves from our savings jokes all we want. But you had earlier in the week had written this a pretty important op-ed about Russia, Ukraine, and here again, you are expressing what what you and I grew up with as a majority view of what mainstream Republican points of view were, and suddenly now you're in the minority again. Explain your concerns right now about where things stand with the war between Russia and Ukraine.
I welcome the president trying to bring peace and a ceasefire there, but it's got to be a just peace. It's got to be one that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and also their ability to align themselves with the West, have treaties. I mean, these are kind of things that are, I would say, red lines in my world for Ukraine. I believe it's our national security interest that Ukraine remain independent. If they don't, and they fall under the Russian thumb, like Moldova will be next, likely Georgia and some other countries on the periphery. Worst case scenario, maybe the Baltics are part of NATO, and they're very vulnerable. And so I just think we should have moral clarity. Russia is the invader. Russia, Putin's the dictator. He's killed all of his opponents, political opponents. Ukraine is the democracy. Zelensky was elected by a free election. And the president at times has muddled those waters, and he's had, I would just call it moral ambiguity on how this war started and who's the bad guy, who's the good guy. Yeah. And I say it's American, but I think this is maybe a traditional Republican. I believe in peace through strength. I believe in standing up for freedom, free markets, rule of law. Yeah. Doesn't mean we have to fight every war. Don't want to fight every war, but we help out countries who are trying to do this in their own borders and push and defend themselves against an invader. I can't think of a more righteous fight than Ukraine right now. And it's beyond me how some of our party does not see this with moral clarity. Putin's the bad guy. Zelensky's the good guy. Russia's the invader. Ukraine's the defender. And I just want to have that moral clarity. And I want us to provide the weapons and the economic support to Ukraine and also the economic punishment to Russia. Right. We should try to choke them of every penny.
Well, they were spared tariffs. How do you feel about that?
That's a little ridiculous. I don't understand it, and it's indefensible.
When it comes to the issue of Russia and sort of you talk about moral clarity, I think the president's made it pretty clear that he's a transactional guy, that he sees this as spheres of influence, and that in some ways, well, Putin's got nuclear weapons. Ukraine doesn't. They're the big dog. Ukraine isn't. That feels like sort of a bit of a mob mentality view of things. Well, that guy's got more control of the turf, and it's just not worth the fight. I'm being too cynical, but is that how you think he thinks about this stuff?
it's hard to judge motives. And I've been very careful in my life to
It's
be
very fair. It's very
evaluate
fair. I
motives,
think
but I
it's
do think it should
it's the
evaluate.
biggest problem we do in media sometimes is assuming motive. And I hear you on that. So I appreciate you saying it.
But there's two or three possibilities, and I think one I've read too, like when you say they sees Xi, Putin, and him as the three big spheres of
Hmm.
influence, and people will fall within one or the other. And I think he sees us as North America, which is a shame if you're a European and you don't want to be under the
Yeah.
sphere of Putin. But I don't know that that's really true. I mean, that's some people think that. Other people say strictly as transactionalist, like you already mentioned.
Right.
He's clearly a total realist in that he doesn't have an idealism DNA in there. And
Which
I'm a
could be a
blunt.
good thing in politics. Realpolitik, there's part of me that's like, look, you got to have realism. You sort of have to do diplomacy with the leaders you have, not the leaders you want. So a little bit of that is good,
I think
but if
100%,
right,
100% realism is not good, though. I don't
right,
think. I'm a guy that yes, you got to have realism because you got to defend your country, know your interests.
right.
But I also want to be a country that stands for good. The free markets, democracy, freedom, rule of law. Those are things that we believe in, and we have been the largest proponents of in the world. After World War II, we've built, roughly 80 years of this international rules, and they've worked.
I was
And
just gonna say,
it's what we like,
you know,
right?
combining the issue with Russia and Ukraine and tariffs to me is a larger narrative is in what you just described, which is there seems to be this belief that the last 80 years have been a failure. When I look at the last 80 years and you compare it to any other 80-year period around in sort of modern civilization, and it may be the greatest 80-year period of lifting people out of poverty, the greatest 80-year
Yeah.
period of helping the United States become a power, okay?
Mhm.
Without, the greatest 80-year period when it comes to secure both economic and personal security, the efforts we've made in health, you just name it. It's been an incredible 80 years, and it's amazing to me
Mhm.
how much, frankly, you get some partisans on both sides that just trash how awful the last 80 years have been. If these are terrible, I can't wait for the good years.
Yeah. This is Chuck. It's been America's century.
Hmm.
It's been our century, and we should not feel ashamed at all about. I mean, God's been good to us, and
Let me just start with a basic cup of coffee. You talked about cigars and scotch, and that's one thing. A lot of people drink coffee, whether they're working class or upper class, and everybody's going to get a price hike.
probably a 15% uh, increase in the cost of coffee, which is a shame on that. But back to your point, this has been America's century, and I don't want to walk away from it. I'd like to see America remain the leader of the free world, a humble leader of the free world, where we work with NATO, Japan, Australia to counter Russia and China, Iran. We work with we can't do it by ourselves, but we can do it with Japan and NATO. And I see us right now sort of walking away from that we're going to be isolationists. We're
Right.
just going to worry about ourselves. And it's going to be us against the world when it comes to the economy and tariffs. That's a more dangerous world. And I don't see that as a positive direction at all.
Look, we've been talking mostly about Russia and tariffs, and it's been consuming us. But there's a real troubling development in Turkey. And what's been most troubling to me is how little the United States has officially spoken out against what Erdogan has done to his chief opponent. Look, Turkey diplomacy is very tricky. And I look, Obama overlooked some things with him. Trump, there again, realpolitik, it happens. But I've been really disappointed in the lack of official response on what's happening in Turkey. What about yourself?
Well, it's increasingly more and more that Turkey can't call themselves a democracy. We Erdogan has become the big man, just sort of like Putin and Xi's done, but they never had a democracy. It's Putin or Xi. But you see Turkey walking away from its democracy roots that allowed it to become a NATO ally, and we should rethink the future of Turkey when it comes to NATO. And we've had these issues with the F-35
Right.
and other things. But Turkey has also been not a good friend of Israel and been very assertive in that area. They were a bit of a malign influence in Syria when
Hmm.
we were there too. So it's hard. Turkey's an off and on friend, and
Friend is a strong,
very
friend's a tough
unpredictable.
word to use there, but okay.
Yeah. I would say though they've been a little more bold in support of Ukraine against Russia. So I would say it's hard to. They're not always on the wrong side. So it's like I say, they're a little bit on and off again on this
Right.
stuff. But I appreciated how they spoke up when it comes to Ukraine's sovereignty and pushing back on our president on some of the peace or some of the negotiations where Turkey feared that Trump was forcing Ukraine to make too many concessions. It was Turkey that spoke up.
Very, very fair point. They've been good on that. Not so good to our Kurdish allies in the Middle
Yeah.
East. I mean, that's
That's a good
even
point.
another issue. So, but ultimately, look, it's not about their policies. It's about, are they a democracy or not? And
Right.
if you're not a democracy, you shouldn't be in NATO. Don't you agree with that?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we're an alliance of free democracies that have a value system, and we don't always have to. You can have a parliament or a Congress, or it could be different forms of democracy, but it should be where the governments reflect the will of the people.
Hey, before I let you go, there's two things that I'm fascinated with about Omaha. One is the College World Series. I grew up in Miami. University of Miami's second home was Omaha for the College World Series. So I love the College World Series. But the other is you have perhaps one of the most famous constituents in America, the Oracle of Omaha, Mr. Warren Buffett. I assume that's an asset to you. How often do you use him as a sounding board, vice versa? What's that like when you've got somebody with that kind of influence, that kind of wealth, and that kind of mind as a constituent?
I met with him early on, and I was sitting with him privately in his office. He reminded me of my uncle, very kind, warm-hearted, gregarious. His dad was the congressman from Omaha in the 1940s.
Right.
And he was a very conservative, anti-Roosevelt Republican. So I did ask him, I said, hey, Warren, what happened? Something happened.
You became a free trader, right? No.
But it was fun to talk to him about his dad. His dad started the Nebraska breakfast, which we do every Wednesday in Washington, D.C. We took about 200 Nebraskans every Wednesday. And all the delegation gets about 12 minutes to say what they're working on. And so it's a tradition going back to 1943, which is incredible. Warren has helped bring a good economy into Omaha, so we got to give him credit for that. But truth for me, he doesn't get too involved politically. He's pretty non-political, apolitical. He was a verbal supporter of Hillary Clinton, but beyond that, hasn't got too involved. His son, Howard, I've developed a great relationship with him. Him and I share concerns about Ukraine. I visited a military unit on the front.
Boy, he's done a whole bunch of stuff on his own with Ukraine. I mean, just amazing work.
I visited this one unit in Kharkiv last September. I was on the front lines, first American congressman, and I was with two others to really get that close on the front lines. It was the unit that he's helped clothe and give weapons to. So he reached out to me, and we talk about every week now. And so I have a good rapport with him. Warren's daughter is a little more on the Democrat side, but we still have a good relationship.
Hey, we all have kids. I got two kids. They may be going in different directions. You never know.
So I would say I have more of a rapport with Susie and Howard. And that's who I talk to more. I really talk to Howard about every week, and I enjoy it. The guy has invested in Ukraine significantly, and I appreciate. He puts his money where his heart's at and his mouth's at. He's walking the talk.
You spent you had a lengthy career in the military. You are very familiar with I think you ended in Nebraska at Offutt, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm getting that wrong. But I'm curious what you make of the various potential cuts that are coming in the military. What are the cuts you think are smart, and what are the cuts are you concerned about, particularly regionally?
I think we'll actually be growing the military. We're going to have a significant plus up in the military spending. I don't mind cutting some. We should review and audit. But we're going to actually grow our budget, and we're going to try to get our military spending up to 4% GDP. So I don't think we're going to be going backwards on that. What I'm a little more worried about is the just rapid firing of some of our top generals without an explanation. And they'll say, what's our right to do
these
so?
cyber firings that apparently are linked to, and look, I'm not going to make you comment on her, this Laura Loomer, but sometimes I look at her and think she's like a character in some movie. Like she doesn't even seem like a real, but could somebody like this have this kind of influence over our cyber command?
She's right off the movie Poltergeist. I shouldn't say that.
You said it. There you go.
she's crazy, and I'll leave it at that. And though the president denies that she had a part of this firing, but the fact is she was there that day or the day prior and recommended that General Hawk and 4 or 5 others get fired, and they did get fired. And there's no other explanation for it. I know General Hawk. General Hawk, he was a colonel when I was a 1-star. He spent 34 years in the Air Force, and every assignment other than schools, he served either in signals intelligence or cyber operations. There was nobody more prepared to run Cyber Command and National Security Agency than him. He was the best that we had in our military, and he was good. And he got fired for no real apparent reason. Other they said he was, they said treasonous, which is baloney, total baloney. This guy was an American patriot, and it set us back. It set us back in cyber operations and our signals intelligence. We're not as good today as we were last week. Because the top 2 people are fired.
Do you trust the way Congress is being run right now? Do you trust that we're going to get genuine oversight over these decisions?
Well, we're going to in this because I'm the chairman of the cyber subcommittee, so I have a say. And we're going to ask, and we're going to bring in leaders, and the Democrats can ask whatever they want, and I get to ask whatever I want. You're going to have some of our party may not go down this path, but you're going to bring in the Secretary of Defense. We're going to bring in, the future chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and they're going to get these questions, even if it's not the purpose of that committee hearing. People, Democrats, Republicans, can ask whatever they want. So we're going to get some oversight of this. But here's my point, and I made it today publicly. The president has the constitutional authority to do this. It doesn't make it right. And okay, I was going to cuss, but I won't cuss. It hurt us. This move hurt America. We're not as good today. And I guarantee you, Russia and China are like laughing at us because we did something so stupid.
But whether it's the tariffs, whether it's the rapprochement to Russia, or whether it's these firings, the only beneficiaries seem to be Xi and Putin.
Yeah, I just think there's a conspiracy, or I don't know what you want to call it. It's a populism. There's probably a very we used to have the Know Nothing Party, back in the 1840s.
Yeah, the Know Nothings. That was a very dangerous movement. I don't think people realize it.
So there is this element that believes this stuff, that anybody that's an incumbent is bad. All these generals are bad. Russia, not so bad. Ukraine's, they're taking our money. There's a whole ecosystem out here that are living on certain social media and cable, and that's what they hear. And I see them. I got like folks with 2 million followers that don't like me because I believe what I believe in there. But they all feed off each other, and they believe that General Hawk was bad for no reason. It's just, what they had a reason, because General Milley was the chairman when he became the commander of Cyber Command. So guilt by association in mind, because General Milley was not liked. Even though,
of course, General Milley was appointed by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
That never seems to matter to people.
And I would say the same thing with Gerald Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He got fired for no reason. They didn't offer a reason. I don't know of a reason to fire him. And all that does is hurt us. It puts us on our heels, and it creates a lack of trust at the very top. I mean, I know that some of these generals, and they're like, Don, I could be next.
Yeah.
And you know what? I don't mind getting fired if I did something wrong.
Sure.
But in this case, these are just guys that are getting fired for the whims of whoever.
Before I let you go, one of my theses these days is that we have 2 political parties that are trying to take the place of 4 political movements, meaning both parties are arguably too big for their coalitions. Can you imagine a day where the Republican Party just split in 2?
It's sort of how we got the Republican Party to begin with. They broke off the Whigs, and we had Fremont as our first nominee, and then Abraham Lincoln. So
not a bad run. Yeah, it was a pretty good run.
But you're right. We have the populist wing, we have the Reagan wing, and I am clearly on the Reagan wing of this party. The Democrat Party, I would say, too, has their populists. Yep. You have AOC gunning after Schumer right now because he dared to keep the government open, and so and I do think I used to think of politics as a linear thing, but it really is a horseshoe that closes at the top. And you have our populist wing that are now voting with AOC on a whole variety of national security measures, Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
FISA, the defense budget, you name it. They've gone all the way over and they're together. And I think we started off our show this way. When I talk to Democrats today, the traditional ones, they sound
Right.
like Ronald Reagan. When I
Right.
talk to our populists, they sound like George McGovern.
Well, we're
And
in the middle of a political realignment. There's no
we
doubt
are.
about it. And I think that maybe it'll all look more obvious in 50 years when you and I are gone and some historians are figuring it out. But
Yeah.
it is a tough place to be in the middle of.
Yeah. My main goal is not to win. My main goal is to be on the right side and try to make a case and try to pull people over. With that attitude, you can't get hurt because
Mm-hmm.
if a door shuts, another door is going to
Yeah.
open, right? That's how I look at it. God's in charge. And
The thing that was remarkable to me about you is you keep coming back for more every 2 years. Some people in your position go find a 6-year or 4-year term to run for something else. What keeps you coming back every 2 years for what is always a multi-million-dollar race,
yeah.
fingernail biting, etc.? What brings you coming back every 2 years?
Well, up until now, it's been love of country. I mean, I really believe my mission: serve God, serve my country. Being a Republican is not, I'm that way because that's what I believe.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more about my beliefs than being part of a team. That's my compass. I'm a
Right,
little
but you
more
must be
conservative.
exhausted.
But it's about serving our country. I love Abraham Lincoln. I love Ike Eisenhower. I love Ronald Reagan. I love Winston Churchill. I love people who've made a difference and stood. If I think about my favorite leaders, they were unpopular at a time, but then world events show that they were the ones that were right. I mean, Churchill was very unpopular in the 1930s. Suddenly by 1940, they go, that's the only guy that knows what's going on here. And
Yeah, he
Abraham
became
Lincoln,
unpopular again, by the way, by the late 40s. But
but those are the people I admire that they follow a compass.
yeah.
And I want to get things done. So, on the good side, the 118th Congress, of all 435 congressmen, I got the most bills passed and signed into law, 9 laws. In the 117th Congress, I was number 2 of 435. I've been able to repair 2 military bases in my district. We have an international airport because of some of the work myself and Deb Fisher. I feel like I'm having an impact, and that's brought me back. Now, I have to admit, 2 years ago, I debated about running again.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't let one of my Democrat opponents was going to get back in the ring, and I felt like I had to win. But also, the Republican Party in Nebraska endorsed against me and censored me, and I felt like I needed to show them that they did not reflect the majority of the people. So I felt like I came back this last election. One, I'm getting results, but 2, I felt like I couldn't let the far left or the far right chase me out. I needed to show them I can win and defeat both of them. And that's what we did this last election. I'm still debating about the upcoming election. My wife has a vote. I have 8 grandkids, and I do think this is not the healthiest lifestyle. I would. So there's some soul searching and praying going on for what I should do in the future. But I do know this: God has a plan, and I'm just going to do the best I can.
Well, Congressman, you've been very generous with your time this Sunday afternoon, and this is what I think I've interviewed you probably a dozen times, but they were always 5 to 10 minute interviews.
Yes.
There's something about this is what I've been most enthusiastic about moving to here. It's like letting it breathe, letting people get to know who you are, what makes you tick. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Thank you. And I've always respected you. I've always felt like you were fair. You asked tough questions, but they were fair. I've had a few interviews where let's talk about Ukraine, and all of a sudden they tell you, I spent 95% of my time talking about the Georgia Senate race. I go, I'm from Nebraska.
Right.
I don't get why you asked me this. I thought we were talking about Ukraine. But I always felt like you were fair. Good question.
Well, we want to get a gotcha moment to make you go viral, right? Isn't that what the whole? No, I'm kidding. Right.
I don't know. Yeah, but I wish you well.
Thank you, sir. All right, enjoy, and I'll tell you, Miami's not going this year to the College World Series, but the next time they do, I'm getting up there and I'm gonna force you to buy me a hot dog.
Yeah, well, we try to do 1 or 2 games a year at the World Series. It's fun.
Yeah, it's a great event. I actually did get to go once. It's unbelievable. It's a great event.
And Forbes rated Omaha the #1 city in America for a reason. We're good.
There you go. We've done the Chamber of Commerce duty. They owe us
Thank you.
both thank you cards on this one. Congressman, this was great. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Well, as you saw, I ended our conversation sort of where I wanted to begin this podcast, which is, is this the start of a larger breakup or a larger realignment inside the Republican Party? As you saw, Don Bacon, very much a student of history, bringing up the know nothings there. I think it's just going to be a lot easier to see in 50 years, as I said during our interview, when I'm long gone. I can't wait to dig, to be a political scientist 30 years from now and dig in sort of to what was really happening here, right? And being able to sort of correctly observe. I don't think people understood what was happening in the 1920s and 30s in the moment. We now know, wow, all of those terrible economic decisions actually led to the rise of Hitler, right? So sometimes, though, you need space in order to see what's happening there. Obviously, part of me wishes people would learn the history of learn a little. We could learn more with history, since so many times decisions, while they don't repeat themselves, they often rhyme with where things are. But anyway, I thought I think it's very clear that Congressman Bacon comes from sort of, as he said, he is calling it the Reagan wing. I think there's plenty of MAGA who want to, Reagan is one of those, they fight over who gets to have him. But I really think he really gave away to me who he is. But Eisenhower, that's the Eisenhower and sort of where I think Reagan came from, those sort of nationalist grassroots in the Barry Goldwater era. But he sort of evolved into somebody that was a bit more of an internationalist at the end of the day. Than he certainly, put it this way, 1980 Reagan was a lot different, I would argue, than 1976 Reagan on that ideological front. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I do think, to understanding the dynamics of the Republican Party today, that's as good of a conversation as you can have with somebody who's in the middle of these fights. Keep an eye on him. He didn't sound like a guy that's going to be seeking re-election for what it's worth, but I'll let him make his decision. I'm not going to overread those tea leaves. But I do think if he isn't seeking re-election, my guess is he'll even be more comfortable speaking truth to power on where he thinks the direction of the Republican Party ought to go. And here we go with an Ask Chuck question. This one is from Tyler Steffi. He's a current student at GW. So he said it was great to hear Jake and I discussed the basketball program for GW. I'm glad to see he listened all the way to the end and to get some attention for GW revolutionary basketball. But here's this question. Do you think the latest Data for Progress poll showing Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, with a 19-point lead over Schumer and a potential 2028 primary will have any impact on his and the rest of the Senate leadership's current makeup or strategy? Thank you much. Keep up the inspiring work on independent journalism. Tyler, I appreciate the question. Look, I'm going to be honest. I'm a tad skeptical of the poll. I'm not skeptical of the direction that I do. I think there's more animation right now in the Democratic Party that's sort of that I view the poll more as anti-Schumer than pro-AOC. I would be careful assuming that is exactly how it would play out, because I think, Chuck Schumer's ability to connect with Western New Yorkers, upstate New Yorkers, is why he became a senator in the first place. He is not somebody that's been stuck just worrying about the 5 boroughs of New York City. I think it is so. But to me, I do think the poll should serve as a bit of a warning shot to Democratic leadership that there is that the status quo is not something people want, that they may be willing to go with somebody that they're maybe politically to their left, politically they're a little less comfortable with, simply because it's time for a new generation of leadership. The question I have, though, is whether AOC really wants to be just another senator, or does she want to use her political influence to shape a presidential race, even if she doesn't win it? In many ways, running and losing a presidential race, see Bernie Sanders, can actually give you more leverage in the party than winning a U.S. Senate seat and being sort of, one of, say, 47 to 52, depending on how many seats your party has at any given time and how much influence you have there. So I think the significance of Schumer's performance in the poll is what I am most focused on less her number, right? To me, it was really about the message to Schumer there. So, again, I think what's going to be more interesting is to see which way she goes. And look, as I said at the beginning, in my opener on this podcast, is there, I think the ingredients are there. If we had an infrastructure that allowed for essentially 4 major parties rather than 2, well, AOC would be the heir apparent to Sanders and running that one-fourth major party, right? On that wall. So I think what I'm going to be intrigued about is how right now there's a lot of anger at Trump. But not every progressive Democrat thinks tariffs are a bad thing. So how the opposition on the left formulates itself, is it going to be, are they going to set aside their own differences? Or is this going to be a moment where you start to see Democratic primaries that are actually very high profile and have sort of high profile ideological clashes like we've seen on the Republican side? And many a Democrat thought that was, the more they saw that on the Republican side, the weaker that made the Republican Party, ironically, and ended up strengthening the Republican Party and strengthening Donald Trump. So I might argue, and I've said it before, that I think the Democrats would benefit of having a lot of primaries that were similar to an AOC versus Schumer, and have them all over the country and sort of get a better sense, get back in touch with the grassroots of their party and make sure they're as representative of where the party wants to go, more so than perhaps where the donors want the party want to go. So I certainly think as I focus on the fracture that I think is taking place on the right side of the political spectrum in this country, a fracture on the left side of this country is almost just as possible. So with that, I will wrap up. I do want to, I was going to use the expression, not to sound like a humble brag, but that's not a humble brag. I'm very excited. I have Houston winning the whole thing, and I have UConn winning the whole thing. I've never done this before, and of course, by uttering it now, I am proving, number one, that I'm taping this just before the end of the UConn South Carolina game on Sunday, and I'm doing this before, obviously, the Florida Houston game. But I am really excited that I might do something I've never done, which is pick both national champs right. Now, of course, I can't win any of I think I have one family pool I can win if Houston wins. But even if UConn wins, I'm not the highest point total, because you'll be shocked to know this. I wasn't the only one in a couple of the pools that I was in that thought UConn would win the whole thing. But hey, I just wanted to get on the record with saying I think I'm on the verge of getting as close that I've ever had of having a men's-women's basketball sweep. So I'm going to pull a muscle, pat myself on the back. And with that, until we upload again.